Okay, it is 2:01 on my computer, so I'm gonna kick us off, get started on time. So welcome everyone to today's webinar, How Governments and Non-Government Organizations Use Academic Science. I'm Nancy Gaucher. I'm with the Water Institute at the University of Waterloo. And I'm hosting this webinar as part of a larger webinar series through Global Water Futures and in particular the Knowledge Mobilization Team. I'd like to also give you a chance to introduce yourself, so please include your name and organization using the chat box so we can start to see who else is on the webinar and everybody else can see so as well. And then I'm going to continue with my introductory remarks in the meantime. So in case you aren't aware, Global Water Futures is Canada's largest water research program based at a university. It's a 7-year-long program that's with a mandate to develop risk management solutions that will help Canada and other cold regions in the world adapt to changes in landscapes, ecosystems, environments. And one of the neat things about the program is that there's core support for the researchers, including knowledge mobilization, which helps facilitate the uptake of research in a way that benefits our society and the end user organizations. Before we get started, I just wanted to go through a couple housekeeping items. Today's webinar is being recorded and we'll share a link with you once the webinar is done. Probably on Monday, you'll get that link. And you have been added in listen-only mode. We have over 180 registrations for this webinar, so we wanted to keep everyone muted, keep things smooth. But if you have any comments or questions throughout the webinar, I'd really encourage you to join us in a conversation. The easiest thing is going to be to use the Q&A function, which is in the menu at the bottom of the screen. That's going to help us keep track of the questions. And hopefully we'll have lots of time at the end of the presentations to go through those questions. Finally, we really want to hear back from you on what you thought the webinar went like, so you're going to receive a link to a survey, a feedback survey, along with that recording, so I'd love to hear your input. So now, let me give you a little bit of a sense of how the next hour or so is going to go. Once I'm done with my introductions, you are going to hear from each of our 3 experts, who have about 10 minutes each to tell you some stories about how they've used academic science and also some tips and tricks on enhancing the applicability of your work. Each speaker is going to have about 10 minutes, and then we'll have time at the end of the webinar for those questions and answers. So come up with some good questions, guys. So by the end of this webinar, I hope you are able to take away 2 things. I hope you will have an improved understanding of how science-based decisions are made in government and non-government organizations. And second, I hope you're going to learn different strategies and tips and tactics on how to enhance that applicability of your academic research. So before we get going, I just wanted to initiate a couple of polls to find out a little bit more about who is on the line. So you should see the 2 questions that popped up on your screen. Take a minute to answer those for me. I'll give you 10 seconds more. This is just going to help our speakers understand the audience that they're speaking to. Okay, I'm going to end that, even though maybe there's some people who haven't answered yet. Let's see the results. So the majority of the people joining us are from academia, about 2/3. We have a good percentage from government, nonprofit, and a little bit of industry. And in terms of our career stage, we've got lots of undergrad and grad students, equal amount to early career and mid-career, also some late career, so that's pretty awesome. I'm going to stop sharing that. And I'm going to move on to the introductions. So I'm going to introduce all of the panelists at the same time, give you a good sense of who you're going to be hearing from, and then I will allow them to take it off. So we have a really great set of panelists today, and I would like to thank them for joining us. First up is going to be Patricia Chambers. She's a well-established research scientist at Environment and Climate Change Canada, where she's been there for almost 30 years in the Watershed Hydrology Department. We invited her to speak because she has a really deep understanding of the science policy interface, and she has firsthand experience in developing science-based policies across Canada. Patricia also understands the academic side of things as well, as a supervisor of various graduate students and also an adjunct professor at the universities of Alberta and New Brunswick. Next up is Chris Parsons. Chris is also a research scientist with Environment and Climate Change Canada in the same department as Patricia, and he has been there for the past 8 months. So I asked Chris to join us because he'll be able to talk about his work with the federal government, but also as someone who's recently joined them. And before that, he was working at the University of Waterloo as an associate professor in earth and environmental sciences. And finally, but not least, is Liz Hendriks. She is the vice president of WWF Canada, a science-based conservation organization that works with to make water science relevant to Canadians, helping them understand water and other resources and the importance of that to themselves and their lives. She's also perfect for this webinar because she's a self-proclaimed water policy wonk, but also has a really great understanding of the importance of basing decisions on science. And she has various touch points with academia as well, including working with the University of Guelph on an eDNA project. If you want to find out more about any of our panelists, feel free to check out their full bios on our website. So thank you and welcome to our guests. With that, I'm going to let Patricia kick it off. I'm going to share my screen, get our slides up.
Good. Well, maybe I can say thanks very much for the intro, Nancy. And while you queue up the slides, I'm going to just jump right into things and get us going. So I think you've got my slides there to line up. And there we go. So let me sort of start right today by making sure that we're all on this same page. And I thought I'd start by just talking about policy making. And very simplistically, policy making translates political vision into action. And I guess in these days, we see a lot of examples of that. We see the various measures that the provincial and political governments have put into place with the vision of being able to, for example, ensuring economic stability or ensuring that desirable health outcomes are met in this current situation of uncertainty regarding the COVID pandemic. Historically, though, policy was, and perhaps sometimes still is today, based on opinion, ideology, intuition, conventional wisdom. But I think I can speak for all of us as scientists and say that we hope that policy making is based on evidence, and that becomes then evidence-based policy making. And what we want to see is that evidence drawing on high quality research that will inform policy and help to contribute to this very important decision making. And I guess before I sort of forget and move on, I do want to point out that it is important to recognize that even very credible research doesn't necessarily determine a policy. There could be in a situation, for example, and I've certainly been down this road, where I think that the environmental research is very valid and very strong, but there may be a need for some other driver, for example, an economic driver. Perhaps the environmental issues in the view of the politicians outweighs the economic needs, say the need for jobs in a particular location. Well, moving on, and next please, Nancy. There are a number of opportunities to influence evidence-based policy making, at least in my opinion. Some policies occur over a very short time period, in the matter of, say, weeks or even days. I think we can see today where this short time period is working. We see that there are emergencies and policies are being rolled out in the case of days or sometimes weeks. Another area which is of a short time frame is judicial proceedings. They usually take place over the course of weeks or months, and research findings and other evidence gets pushed into their time frame of weeks and months, leading to a policy decision on a relatively short time frame. I think speaking more typically, though, we see research influencing policy over the period of months or years, and this is by informing operations or organizations that operate in a civil society, for example, watershed authorities, but also influencing government decision-making and government priorities. Next, please, Nancy. But I think one of the things to keep in mind is that improving evidence-informed policymaking is not simply a matter of providing more evidence and hoping that it's used for. In many cases, what is required for policymaking is to be able to answer some specific questions. And I've taken from a presentation and report from a few years back, what I think are 4 key questions to think about in developing evidence or research base for a policy decision. One of the things that the policymakers will first look at is what is the current understanding of the issue in question, the issue for which policy needs to be made. And then secondly, what is that evidence of sufficient quality? It's written here as what exists and who produced it, but it really gets down to the nub of it. Is it high quality evidence? The third question that's typically asked by the policymaker, well, what changes have been observed in the past and what could happen into the future? And then finally, the fourth question that tends to come out from the policymaker when looking at evidence, is the evidence becoming stronger over time? Or is it sort of looking more wishy-washy and confounded? I'd like to sort of take these various questions as well as some of the timeline aspects and hopefully make them a little bit more realistic for you by considering an example, one of the many examples that I've been involved in looking at how science, academic, government science can work together and influence policy making. And the example I'm going to provide you is one that involved a University of Alberta colleague and University of Alberta master's students whom I co-supervised and whose research became very much the evidence used in the decision making. So if we move to the next slide, please. I'm going to talk to you about a very specific example that took place, well, it's taken place over decades, to be honest. It's called the Kemano Completion Project. And Nancy, I'm going to ask if you can move the pointer around a little bit and help point a few things out for me. So the Nechako River was regulated in 1954 to produce an aluminum smelter, power for an aluminum smelter. And if you can see right in the center of the map, there's a whole bunch of arrows. And these, a little lower, please. And these arrows are pointing to the reservoir that was created. And originally the Nechako River, and if you move sort of to the right, you'll see it flowed to the right, then it moved north up to this little village of Fort Fraser. And then it continued further to the left, to the right or east to Prince George, where it joined the Fraser River heading due south. So I'm sorry, I'm challenging your geographical skills there. But the Nechako River used to flow entirely to the Fraser River, which flows down to the Vancouver and out to the ocean. What happened in the early 1950s is the British Columbia government came to an agreement with Alcan that they would allow this river to be regulated. And all of that area backed up into that Nechako River. There was a new channel created and the water flowed from the Nechako River over to this little spot on the graph, on the map that says Kemano. And that was where the hydroelectric power generation station was. And there was a drop of about 1,000 meters from the original Nechako River down to Kemano, and that created the hydroelectric power that was then sent up to Kitimat, where the smelter is. So in the 1950s, Nechako River was regulated. Half of the flow was diverted out of the Nechako River to produce the hydroelectric power for the Alcan aluminum smelter. Well, at the time that the river was, the first agreement was put in place in the 50s, the government also said in that agreement, well, Alcan, you could come back and take another 50% of the river at a later date. And so in the 1980s, Alcan came back to the government and said, well, we want our second allotment of 50%. The result would be that the flow in the river would be reduced to 20% of its original flow, possibly impairing sockeye salmon health. So the question came about, and perhaps it seems naive now, but the question was, will the Kemano completion project impair the river health? And next slide, please. Well, I guess it's not surprising where we went with this, but at the time I was in a long sort of long working relationship with the province of British Columbia, as was the student who came on board to do his master's. And so they asked us, the British Columbia environment people, could you, given that we've got this decision that is going to be made in a few years, could you develop a project that will provide us with evidence to go forward and inform the decision making? At that time we didn't know how the decision making would be. Would it be a court case? Would it be legislation or whatever? But using sort of a generic outline of how to address, how to provide evidence into policy making, we developed our study together. The BC folks, me as the government scientist, and the University of Alberta people. And we used a generic formula. And next, please, Nancy. We developed our specific questions. And the generic formula is very similar to those original questions I showed you a few moments ago in my first slide. So we asked the question, will regulation increase aquatic weed abundance? Because that was our specialty, looking at aquatic weeds in the river. There was already known to be aquatic weeds, and they had increased in time, but the concern was, would they choke the river up? And so we followed the approach of looking at existing evidence, looking at quantifying and obtaining new evidence in order to be able to do predictive modeling, and then look at scenarios. What would happen if this much versus that much versus another amount of water was removed from the river as a result of the Kemano completion project? And then finally, we had to move to the stage where we translated this knowledge into something useful for the decision makers. And I will point out at this point, the decision ended up going to court hearings, very, well, what can I say? A lot of like what you would see on TV. There was the judge up on the stand, there were the lawyers. The student and I worked very closely on translating the information from his thesis and the two papers resulting from his thesis into evidence for the use by the judicial review. I was presented my evidence. I was cross-examined by lawyers. But I must admit, it was a very rewarding process to feel that something useful was being contributed. Next slide, please, Nancy. Well, just in a nutshell, I'm not going to go into the details of what we pulled together and how we presented it and everything, but the recommendation from the judicial review was that the Kemano completion project should not proceed. And specifically rewarding to the student and I was the fact that they recognized that our research on how the completion of the project could lead to the expansion of the weed beds, them choking up the river and potentially impairing salmon passage. This was recognized in the review. Next, please, Nancy. And so there were a number of lessons for us that came out of this. And I'm going to summarize a few of them here and then give a little bit of advice, at least from my perspective, on my next slide before finishing up. But I found that what was so important was that the evidence needs to be timely. In other words, it needs to meet timelines. There was no point in trying to say, well, I need one more year of field data because the court case was set for this date and be there or lose the chance. The other thing was the evidence had to be robust. And I think that's a fairly, I don't have to give a lot of details about that because I think we in the research community understand that. But I think what is very important is it has to be accessible. It can't just be a case of, well, I'll slip my published paper or my thesis under the door of my lab or office and hope the right person stumbles upon it. Next, please. So finally, then, let me just sum up that when you're thinking about what can I do to get my research into policy making, well, in our case, I think even though it was a judicial hearing that was in a short time frame, it was held over the period of months, we had an ongoing relationship with the provincial policymakers and scientists so that we were able to get on board early. Another thing is to think about using well-established protocols and models. You don't want somebody saying, oh, well, you've got a brand new tool. How do we know that it works? And I guess another point too is to make sure that this science is conveyed in a way that will be helpful and useful to the policymakers. And finally, I guess 2 points of advice, one here, and perhaps put the next one up, Nancy, is to remember that your advice is to be frank, fearless, and doesn't second guess what the policymakers who are listening want to hear. So it really is the right evidence at the right time and seen by the right people. And that, in my mind, sums it all up. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Patricia. I am going to set Chris up with his slides and ask him to jump right in.
Okay, thank you very much, Nancy, and thanks, Patricia. I found that really useful as well. So as Nancy explained, I'm relatively new in the federal government, so I'm working in the same team as Patricia, but previously I was on the other side of the academic government partnerships, working with provincial and federal government organizations, and I'm still involved in that project. So I'm going to use the example of a project that I actually started at the University of Waterloo, and now I'm continuing with in Environment Canada. And I've set an imperfect example of government academic partnership because, not because I think it's being badly done, but because I am not an expert in government academic partnerships at all. I've had relatively limited experience, but I do have experience on kind of both sides of it now. So I'm going to share a few thoughts on what I think has worked in this project and what I think hasn't worked, and hopefully some of the early career people out there can learn from some of my mistakes, and feel free to point out other mistakes I've made, or if you've got anything else to contribute as we're going along, other tools you can think of to use, feel free to put them in the chat box. I'll try and keep an eye on that, or put a question in. So could we move on to the next slide, please? So I tried to distill, I think, what works in terms of government academic partnerships into really just a few points, and then I'll go into each of these in the example. And I guess the first one is to consider whether or not you actually want an authentic collaboration. What do you want out of a partnership? Do you want to influence policy? Because it's, as a government scientist, the science that we do needs to be of benefit to the citizens of the country. That's the be all and end all of the research that we do. It's got to be innovative, it's got to be interesting, but it's got to be useful for citizens. That's not necessarily the same objective in academia, and you don't always need to have a government collaboration. And I know NSERC really like to see letters of support from different government organizations, but don't make it an afterthought. If you want to go after collaboration, go after it really with desire to get everyone involved. It is a lot of work. It's not. I don't think it's particularly difficult to do, but it is a lot of work to do well. And I would say, don't bother to say that you're going to collaborate if you're not going to really go for it. So try and think, and that requires some evaluation of yourself and what you want to get out of your research from the get-go. And so with that in mind, then if you do decide that you really do want to collaborate, I'd say it's important to track down and engage with the right people very, very early on in the research process. So even co-developing the research questions. And again, this is a little bit of self-reflection. Of course, as an academic, as a grad student, you might have a research question, and you're used to pitching your research. You can, given maybe 2 minutes to pitch how important it is, how it's going to change the world. But keep in mind that maybe your goals don't necessarily align with that of your partners. And so try to figure out how relevant actually is your research idea to your partners. Are they going to be interested in it? And I think that you only really get that by talking to people, networking, putting yourself out there. As Patricia said, publishing a paper which might not be read by a very large number of people isn't enough. You need to go to meetings and speak to people and start exchanging ideas. The next point would be get buy-in and feedback from stakeholders for the research ideas as you're starting to develop them, because as Patricia was saying as well, that it's not just what is legislation, it's how collectively in society we think about things. So if you identify all the main players in your subject area and how your research question might be relevant to different people, and speak to them about it and see, do they agree? And that can actually mold your research questions very early on as well. And it might take a different direction to what you initially thought of. The next point would be figure out and clearly define the mutual as well as individual objectives, expectations, and timelines. So as a grad student or as a postdoc, you want to get your papers out, you want to get your thesis out, and you want to publish in a high impact factor journal, and that's great. That's absolutely fine. That may not be the same objectives as, say, a research scientist in Patricia's position. I mean, I'm sure, yes, she likes to get papers out in science, like anyone else, but maybe she's ultimately more interested in influencing the direction of a government policy. And so to achieve that aim, you might have a different timeline or a different flexibility on timelines or different objectives. So try and figure out actually what your partners want and what you want early on, and agree on those things. And then the last point, which I think I've actually not been so good at doing in the past, is maintain the momentum. When you engage with collaborators, keep formal and informal communications open the whole way through the project. So if you agree or disagree with any of those, please feel free to write into the chat box or put a question in, but I'll carry on with the examples. So could we go to the next slide? So the project I'm going to talk about is it's an ongoing project. It started in 2017, and it's investigating phosphorus loading and speciation changes in the Thames River. And so I'm sure a lot of you are aware there's big problems with eutrophication and algal blooms in the western basin of Lake Erie, as you can see on the bottom right. And it's a long, complicated story that we can't get into too much in 10 minutes, but there was problems with eutrophication in the 60s, effective policy was introduced, the lake got better, and now it's got worse again. And there's a lot of research going on. And one thing that I became aware of working in this area was that there's a little bit of a disconnect sometimes between research into where the excess phosphorus that ultimately leads to these, or is a strong contributor to these algal blooms and eutrophication issues, how it is exported from the landscape in the source areas, so edge of field, wastewater treatment plants, these kind of things, and then the modeling at the lake end. And between the two, they don't necessarily match up. So there's a lot of processes that are happening in the river which are not really accounted for so well. So I started to chat about this with a collaborator at the time from the provincial government, Mohammed, and we came up with a couple of research questions about, well, how much do the phosphorus and nitrogen loads change in the transport between the headwater source areas and the river mouth? And then with the idea that the governments, provincial, federal, binational governments have agreed to a 40% reduction in total phosphorus loads to the western basin of Lake Erie by 2025. Is there any way that we can actually intervene within the river channel rather than just focusing on the source areas to decrease the phosphorus load? So those are kind of the main questions going into it. But obviously this is a multifaceted problem. Perhaps going into it thinking as one person, as one academic, I'm going to be able to change all this is a little bit naive, and there's a lot of players. There's the provincial government, the federal government, the conservation agencies, and lots of academics already working on that. So one of the things we did very, very early on, Mo and I, once we'd discussed what our main objectives were, is try and actually just formally make a list of, well, who do we need to contact? Who do we want as partners? Who do we need to get this information out to eventually? And who do we need to get input from? Next slide, please. And so we came up with a host of different engagement tools to try and get the word out on what we were planning to do and get input. So at the point where we could still mold the research. So we did a huge number of presentations all over the place to government working groups, in conferences, just conference presentations, which didn't really contain any data, but just these are the research questions. This is where we're coming at it. How do you think we can mold it? And we put together a fact sheet, just 1 or 2 paragraphs explaining what the project was about. And we found that that was a very effective way of engaging with a very broad audience. And then the other thing was just phoning people up, like figure out, well, who is there in Amafra? So that's the provincial agricultural department. Give people a call, see what they think about your ideas. Are you replicating anything that's happened before? and then forming formal partner steering committee meetings. So as you would with a project, a master's or a PhD project, you would have your committee members for your thesis and then your examining body. And we thought that it would be useful for the project to set up the same kind of formal communication process throughout. So of course, all of this is a lot of effort. The other thing that we realized is there's other people attacking the same kind of questions from a different angle. So all of these people are very, very busy. And one of the things we found that was effective was partnering with as many different people as possible who are doing similar kind of research and communicating all at the same time. So instead of having to ask people to come to 6 different meetings for 6 different academics working on similar things from different angles, organize a day all together. So we teamed up with the University of Windsor and other people at the University of Waterloo to communicate. Next slide, please. So, well, what did this actually look like? Obviously, as a relatively limited research team at the University of Waterloo, trying to tackle a whole watershed. I mean, the Thames River is about 300 kilometers long, 6,000 square kilometers, and trying to tackle all of the source areas to the river mouth is quite ambitious. So in the end, we ended up partnering with Environment Canada, the City of London, Ministry of Environment and Climate and Conservation Parks, sorry, they changed their name. And we ended up with this network of 16 water quality sampling sites across the watershed. And then sampling was conducted, and analysis was conducted by various different organizations. So the sampling was conducted by Environment Canada, University of Waterloo, City of London, and then various different analyses were sent to different labs. So figuring out the competencies and the availability of different partners. Then all of the data analysis was then done at the University of Waterloo and now in Environment Canada. And what we found, for instance, is that maybe so the Ministry of Environment and Conservation Parks and the City of London, they had a lot of capacity to analyze samples. They have labs running, doing these kind of parameters all the time. But what they lacked is the people and the time to actually do something with that. And that's, of course, something that academics can do and research scientists can do reasonably well. And so I think this was a success up until this point, that we managed to get all of the key players together, work out what they could contribute, and get everyone on board. Where there was a little bit of a fail of the project is, of course, there was multiple different aspects to this. We've got a master's student, Nadie, who I think is on listening in, looking at Fanshawe Reservoir, so the effect of reservoirs on phosphorus retention. There's another partner and a PhD student in Western University looking at benthic algae in the headwaters, and you get into the detail of all these different little projects. And one of the things I didn't do was maintain good communications with all of the participants in the project throughout. So we had a lot of intensity going in, setting up sampling regimes, setting up who was analyzing it. And actually this was in 2016, 2017 this started, and we'd arranged to go for 3 years. There was actually a staffing change at Environment Canada, and the people that we'd arranged to carry on sampling with had left into a different position, and the new person came in and didn't know what this project was about, and the sampling stopped. And because I hadn't maintained kind of regular, it would have been very, very simple just to maintain a bi-weekly phone call, how things going, and I didn't, because I thought things are set up, we can reach out formally with the steering committee meeting every year. And that cost us, because we ended up with a shorter data set than we could have had, I think, had the communications been maintained very informally the whole process. So one of the things that people have asked me before is, well, what does engagement look like? And I thought I was doing everything right, setting up all these formal arrangements and institutional agreements. And very often, I think it just comes down to picking up the phone, shooting an email, maintaining the contact in a very, very informal way. So next slide, please. So what I wanted to focus on then is splitting up the objectives and working relationships into formal and informal. And I think I did a good job really with the formal institutional agreements that was with the Office of Research at the University of Waterloo. And this is formal collaboration agreements and research contracts and data access requests. And of course, all of this is necessary if you're going to be dealing with a large, sometimes bureaucratic organization like Environment Canada or the Ministry of Environment. And that's something I think academics need to be a little more conscious of. I know, for instance, I've been in a situation on both sides of this where I've been putting together a proposal, and I send out a request for a letter of support with 2 days to go. And I've also had that on the receiving end in Environment Canada. And there's not time then to have all of these formal agreements in place that really need to engage far, far beyond that time. So that's one of the things I think we need to be aware of, is the flexibility of the different participants to put all these formal collaborations in place. And I think I did that reasonably well at that time. But there's a lot of then individual discussions, just informal meetings, update presentations, emails and phone calls that need to happen continuously throughout the process. And we need to agree on whether it's formal or informal. I think we need to agree on timelines, deliverables, attribution right from the beginning, who's going to be on the papers, who's going to get access to what data, and then flexibility about all of those things. That yes, you might ultimately want to develop the best model possible to get that high impact factor paper, but as Patricia was saying, if the timeline for the government is, say, the domestic action plan is for phosphorus reductions into Lake Erie is going into action, and there's a 1 year or say 3 month period for comment, we can't extend that 3 month period. Either the policy is going to go ahead with whatever information we've got at that time. So what is the flexibility of the participants and what timelines are we working on? Okay, next slide, please. So the key scientific conclusions, I mean, this project is still kind of underway, is that yes, the phosphorus form changes significantly through the watershed, and that changes to the nutrient export at the source don't necessarily result in changes at the river mouth and then impact the lake immediately. Reservoirs have a massive importance as a modifier of the nutrient load in the watershed. The City of London actually has a fairly large impact. It's 4 times higher phosphorus loadings on a unit area basis than agricultural areas, and that the phosphorus bioavailability and nutrient limitation change drastically throughout the watershed, but there's a strong seasonal trend. So I think we've got some really good scientific output from that. And then next slide, please. And now how is that going to be integrated into policy? How is that going to influence things? And that was part of the reason that I personally decided to move into federal government, was I realized it was very important for me that I wanted my research to have some impact on society. And I felt like working within the federal government was a good way to do that. So in terms of outcomes at the moment, we've got conference presentations lines up, we've got peer review papers in preparation. We've been invited to give presentations to government working groups. So in terms of kind of scientific output, I feel like, yes, we've from an academic perspective, we've ticked the box. We're getting the papers out, we've got presentations, and we've got, I think, some increased recognition of the importance of reservoirs, and Fanshawe Reservoir particularly, that may be generating some more funding for continued monitoring and research. And now I'm at the stage of, as Patricia was saying, translating this into how is this going to influence policy? And I think this is going to be the next big test for this project. I can anticipate that some of the policy outcomes could be, well, changing the funding allocation for BMPs. So are BMPs upstream and downstream of the reservoirs equally valuable, and should they be funded equally? Could it result in changing dam operations to maximize phosphorus retention in the reservoir, for example, to intercept phosphorus over a very large watershed area? And I think this is going to be the key challenge now, and I'm interested to hear from other people on the webinar how you think the best way to go about this is. Personally, I plan to just carry on with those informal updates, and I plan to prepare kind of fact sheets also after the publications come out of what are the key conclusions, and then reference the publications and try and get that out to the same people, and hold a meeting to all of the partners that we engaged with right at the beginning and all of the stakeholders to try and get these points out. But I'd welcome any other ideas. Okay, and next slide, please. And so this is just some of the people who've been involved in the work and the funding organizations. So thank you to them. And there's a question from Joy. Can I answer that one now, or do you want to move on, Nancy? Sure. So the question is, what would you include in your informal emails, coffee meetings, so that it's relevant enough not to seem potentially annoying to those busy stakeholders? I think keep it short and sweet, and just maybe bullet points of, well, what you've been up to over the last what you've been up to over the last few weeks. So, oh, I've been out to Fanshawe Reservoir, we've sampled a few times. Did you notice this algal bloom? Or just touching base, have you guys sampled over the last couple of weeks? Did you get everything you wanted? Very, very short things like that, I think are okay. I think it's just important to even if people don't get back to your emails, it just popping up in their inbox is a kind of a little reminder that, hey, this project is going on, everyone's busy, everyone has multiple projects, and don't send paragraphs and drafts of papers which are in a poor state because people aren't going to read them, but just bullet points of what you've been doing, where you're up to, if you need any input, just to remind people the project is ongoing. And yeah, I hope that answers it.
Great, thank you so much, Chris. Both great stories from you and Patricia. I'm gonna keep things moving and let Liz tell her story, and then we'll have some time for questions if you guys have questions for Patricia and Chris to come back to them.
Thanks, Nancy. So just to add to that, I would say that if they're genuine partners and there's co-creation, then they're not stakeholders, and there's some vested interest on their part to hear from you. So ideally that relationship is being developed. But anyways, I wanted to say thank you to Nancy and the Water Institute and Stephanie from the Global Water Futures for having me today. I also want to acknowledge that I'm standing on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and Toronto is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. For those who, next slide, please. For those who may not know, WWF is one of the largest multinational conservation organizations in the world. We have a presence in over 100 countries. In Canada, you can see a map of where our offices are. Our head office is Toronto, but we do have offices across the country and in the far north. We focus as a science, we focus on, in Canada, on nature-connected communities, science, research, and innovation, freshwater, oceans, and Arctic. And as a science-based conservation organization, we do work with academia in a range of ways. Every program kind of has different partnerships. I'm specifically going to share how some of the freshwater conservation program work has intersected and what I've personally learned from the process. Next slide, please. So in 2017, we released the WWF Watershed Reports. It was the first national assessment of health and threats to Canada's freshwater. It was a huge undertaking, as you can imagine. It started with actually 2 years, and so this is the first kind of intersection on this specific project with academia. We spent 2 years working with the National Science Advisory Committee. So knowing that freshwater ecosystems across the country are so diverse, we really made sure we had national representation. Those advisors are still part of our program, more informally, of course, but it was really important to us that we represented freshwater ecosystems appropriately at a national level and kind of with people who could give us insight into what type of data was available and accessibility issues. So really pairing that important scientific rigor with what can you say at a national level. Our country is huge. That was a really important role academia plays with us, and we have different science advisory groups for different projects across the board. The next part that was really influential is data. So we collected data to inform our reports from government databases, from citizen science, from Indigenous communities, from watershed authorities, different authorities across the country. So in Ontario, it's conservation authorities. Quebec is a different authority. So kind of different jurisdictions have different governance structures. And Chris, you quickly mentioned data and who might have access to the data on one of your points. And I want to say this is so important. Having access to public data and putting your data up into either open databases or government, preferably government databases, is so critical in terms of long-term opportunity for monitoring that you might be doing in your research. And I have to say, we've been doing this work for 6 years, maybe a bit more. And the relationship around open data has really evolved. You know, government now has open data, funding requirements. I know a lot of funding requirements in the North require academic institutions to actually publish their raw data. And this is a pretty hard line for me, you know, in academic institutions, when we say we're there for higher learning and it's about a knowledge base, but yet you don't share that data and that knowledge, it's disingenuous. And it's a really important part about building a greater knowledge base of Canada's resources. So freshwater specifically, but for me, but I think this is an issue in a whole range of areas of knowledge. Next slide. Oh, no, before you go, move on. So the watershed, oh, can you just skip back? Just one more point. So the watershed reports, we released them in 2017. We kind of observed there was a lot of lack of data. So again, post your data on open data sources or databases, or contact us directly. But also a lot of groups use this work now as their framework, and we're working with government to use this as a framework as well. And we did find major data gaps in specific indicators, but we also found some pretty key stressors on our watersheds. So one of our gaps, so this work really informs everything we do moving forward. All our programming kind of is driven by our watershed reports result. And one of those results was benthic invertebrates, a really keystone species for understanding freshwater health. And there was major gaps. Not surprising, Canada's a huge country. We can't be everywhere at all times. So one of our projects, and now you can flip the slide, thanks Nancy, is working on sequencing. It's called STREAM, so sequencing the river for environmental assessment and monitoring. And this is where we're working with Living Lakes to help train, who trains communities, citizen science, excuse me, in benthic monitoring, and University of Guelph. And so we collect these samples, they get sent to the University of Guelph, who uses eDNA technology to sample the process. But we're also working with Environment Canada, the Cabin program, to ensure that that data is then integrated and stored in a long-term database so future users have access to it. So what I love about this project, and you can, well, there's many things I love about this project, but if you flip to the next slide, we have really diverse partners. And I'm happy to, given the time restraints, I didn't want to go into great depths of this program, but if you have questions, I'm happy to answer or contact me later. But this project, we actually have very different purposes in the project. So Living Lakes does a lot of training and community capacity building. We are really driven by addressing the data gaps we found in our watershed reports. Environment Canada has an internationally renowned methodology around benthic invertebrates and really are leaders in this. And University of Guelph is about environmental DNA technology and understanding genomics and how we look at biodiversity. And so we all want different things out of this project, and yet we've come together under this umbrella to find ways of moving forward, moving the science forward for different messages. And so super awkward, we all kind of are in our own bubbles and speak different languages, but not English and French, but you know, there's the academic language, there's the NGO language, there's government speak. But yeah, we kind of worked through that to find this way that we could really do systems change on this monitoring program. Let me just check my notes. So next slide, please. I'm trying to speak faster because I love the question period. So my hot tips in terms of academics working with other stakeholders or partners is, and Chris kind of mentioned this, is be honest. So why is it you want to partner? Do you actually want to share your work? And if it's yes, learn to co-create. I think learn how to work past our different languages and different silos. And if it's not, that's okay. Do it, own it, that this is about theoretical knowledge building, and that's what you're doubling down on, and that's okay. We need that kind of science too. Don't be a plug. So people who know me on the line have heard me, I'm sure, 1,000 times give this analogy. You have the plug and you have the outlet. And sometimes in WWF, we've done this in the past before, is you create work or research or report because you're like, this is amazing information. Someone should know this. But you're not God's gift to anyone. So your research and your knowledge creation isn't God's gift unless you've worked with the outlet to make that connection. So I would say, like, understand what the outlet needs and then be the create the plug to make the connection. It's really important to making sure we're not creating knowledge and messaging and data in a vacuum. Talk. And again, like, as many people outside of your bubble that you can talk to about your research is so critical. So we recently launched a tech challenge around innovation in the water sphere. And one of the really key pieces of advice I was given was make sure your innovators have spoken to 50 to 100 people. So again, to ensure you're not just making a plug that has no outlet, how many people can you talk to make it relevant? And so it's, if it's community work, if it's like, build those relationships so there's an understanding around the work we're doing. And then my last point is this fail fast, and fail better. And if anyone had all the answers, we wouldn't find ourselves at the brink of an ecosystem collapse. So I think all our sectors, the NGO world, government, we're all trying to transform and adapt in a way that makes our work relevant and has an impact. Like, we all wake up in the morning to try and make an impact, right? We're not trying to say, oh, I just want to, you know, go about my day, which I guess is okay too if you want to do that. But I think the faster we can be uncomfortable in reaching outside of our sectors, you know, for some academics, it is the idea of open and shared data is really uncomfortable. The idea of citizen science is really uncomfortable. If we can learn to understand that discomfort, or maybe understand where other sectors are coming from, I think we can make those mistakes and move faster into systemic change. Because I think the best projects and the projects I'm the most proud of at WWF or in my career have been where we have cut through the sectors and dropped our barriers and are really successful and have this great impact on the ground. And so I really believe in that kind of fail fast and fail better to move forward, move both the science and knowledge forward, but also the impact on the ground. That's it for me.
Okay, thank you so much, Liz. We have some time for questions. What I'm going to do now is introduce my co-partner, my moderator, Stephanie Merrill. She might turn on her video so you can even see her. She's my counterpart at the University of Saskatchewan. We work really closely together in supporting knowledge mobilization through Global Water Futures. She's going to help us moderate the question and answer period.
Thanks, Nancy. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much, panelists. That was really, really fantastic. We have a couple of questions, but we do have, you know, a few minutes. So if anybody else would like to submit, I will take those and have a look. So Patricia, I see, has figured out how to answer directly back to a question, but maybe Patricia, you could expand for the rest of the group. So we had a question from Roland, who wanted to know, he says, as academic researchers, we are very good at generating evidence that has policy implications, and we're often, whoops, my screen disappeared, sorry guys. We are often motivated to try to have it influence policy, but we rarely know who develops policy, and that makes it very hard to communicate to the right person in the right way. So he wants to know if anybody has any tips on how to identify and then talk to the right person. And Patricia, you did offer him some direct advice, but do you want to expand on that for everybody?
Well, you're just going to need to take your mute off.
Here, I can do it for you.
There. Isn't that the way you talk to yourself, and that's when you say your best things and no one hears them? Well, what I had responded to Roland, and thanks, Roland, for the question, was often, you know, you think that there's this one policy guru sitting out there somewhere, and if you could only find that person, the world's problems would be solved because you could give them the answers. And I've found myself that's rarely the case. It's the policy is sort of batted around by a number of people, goes back and forth in and outdoors, so on and so forth. I found myself that the best way is to find somebody who carry your science forward to the actual committee or group that are making decisions. And I suggested in the chat box that often if you could make those very close connections with the local people, and I mean by the local people with the federal and provincial governments, the scientists or the monitoring people, they will recognize the value of your research and help carry it forward to the policymakers. The other thing that can come about too is you'll sometimes see these announcements come out from federal and provincial governments. We're going to clean up the oil sands. We're going to clean up Lake Winnipeg, Lake Erie, whatever it may be. And oftentimes there's an opportunity when these announcements are being made to speak to your local MP, MPP, MLA, whatever, and say to them, this is what I do, and I can help you achieve that goal. And so they have a contact that they can put forward. So I think it's to take advantage of the local people who may not be the policymakers themselves, but have the window to that to help carry your science forward.
Great. Erin wants to know a little bit about career pathways. So she says, if you want to translate your academic experience into environmental policy career, how do you do this? Specifically, there doesn't seem to be a position title that necessarily matches up with what I'm looking to do. For example, there aren't water policy positions listed on a job site. So I'm wondering if maybe Liz, you could tackle this as somebody who works to influence policy but doesn't necessarily have that title.
Yeah. If only, why isn't there water policy jobs? I think in government there actually might be, but Patricia could maybe confirm that. So one, and I think this might answer somebody else's question. The previous question is, there is a government directory, and I think it's really important to understand like how bureaucracy works. Like I've been in this work 15 years, and every time I talk to bureaucrats, I'm like, can you just explain your reporting structure? Because I think it's really important, and there's like committees in Ottawa, if you're talking about the federal level, there's like a fisheries committee. So really understanding how democracy, our government operates, how Ottawa might operate, I think is really helpful in leading you to understand who might be the appropriate people. It's just really critical to understand how the machinery works, and it does take time, and kind of every file might be someone slightly different. Now on to, career paths. There is a bit of, I don't know, my experience as a bit of make the job you want to have. I spent a lot of time before having formal employment, kind of consulting and doing a lot of like policy type work where there was no formal job. Very uncomfortable not to have benefits. I really enjoy benefits, secure employment, but there is a bit of job creation. But I also think being able to have the skills to communicate science and to communicate why that's meaningful to other people will serve you well when applying for a range of jobs. So it might take a while, or, wouldn't that be amazing if you could get hired and then make the job what you want it to be? And I think sometimes that is not always the case. I've been really lucky where I've been in roles that I can do a lot of self-creation because I can communicate the benefits. So really learning the skill of communicating the science in a way that people understand, sound bites, and working like why it matters, and then being able to fill in the blanks.
Great.
Could I add to that just a little bit as well? Thanks, Liz. So one of the things that I wasn't so aware of until I started working with government was how many jobs are only posted internally. That there's a huge job bank of positions which are only available to people already working within the public sector. So one of the pieces of advice I would give to people looking to get into policy making, government decisions, and understanding how this whole process works is get any job in government. Even if you might be scrolling through jobs thinking maybe that's not particularly relevant, that's close, but that's not really what I want to do. There's a lot of temporary positions, casual work for a few months. I'd say apply to that, get yourself into the system. You can then start networking within the government, and then you do have access to apply within the organization. And it is complex. I've been there 8 months now in Environment Canada, and figuring out how the whole structure of the organization works and how decisions are actually taken. I mean, I've been very lucky. I work in the same team as Patricia, and she's been guiding me through this. But yeah, it's even within the organization, it's challenging to understand. And I agree with Patricia. Your best bet is to find a kind of a conduit, find someone who's experienced within the government, who's maybe a researcher as well, who speaks the same language as you, to help you carry your science and translate it into a form that might be usable.
Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you to all of the panelists. We're at the top of the hour. Apologies to those whose questions we did not get to yet. But I wanted to make sure that we finish on time and respect everybody's time. If you might see the slide up for you, if advertising the next webinar that's coming up, it's on May 13th, featuring Terry Duguid. So if you're interested in national water policy, you might be interested in joining that panel. I will include the registration link in the follow-up email so that you can sign up for that if you're interested. With that, I'm going to say thank you very much to our panelists once again. Your stories were amazing, really great tips. I think it was very practical. I think there's some interesting tidbits that people will be able to take with them moving forward. And thank you very much to Stephanie for moderating and helping making sure that everything moves smoothly. So with that, I hope everyone enjoys their Friday afternoon, their weekend. Stay safe. And till next time. Thank you.